The sphenoid bone, depicted in this model in the color red, is a complex bone. It actually contacts all of the other bones of the cranium, the frontal bone, the parietal bones, the temporal bones, the occipital bone, and the ethmoid bone. The sphenoid bone can be divided into a number of regions: a central body, and because it is sometimes compared to a butterfly, a pair of greater wings and a pair of lesser wings, and then also delicate pterygoid processes. The large greater wings can be observed in the posterior of the orbit, in the lateral view of the cranium, so visible on the lateral surface of the cranium, making up much of the cranial cavity when viewed from the internal base of the skull, and also visible from the inferior view of the skull. The body of the sphenoid bone can be observed if other bones are removed or cut, and so it can be observed in the internal base of the skull as the floor of the cranial cavity, from the inferior view if the lower jaw is removed, and from a mid-sagittal view. The lesser wings of the sphenoid bone can be observed as a part of the posterior orbit and also from the internal base of the skull. The pterygoid processes of the sphenoid bone can be viewed from an anterior view if the bones of the face are removed, or from the inferior view of the skull. The pterygoid processes serve as the origins of the pterygoid muscles, which function in chewing. Between the greater and lesser wings of the sphenoid bone is a fissure known as the greater orbital fissure. When the sphenoid bone is viewed from an anterior view of the skull, one can observe this fissure in the orbit, and one can also observe the lesser orbital fissure which separates the sphenoid bone from the maxillary and zygomatic bones. 3 cranial nerves exit through the greater orbital fissure. These are cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, the oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens, which allow for the movement of the eye. When the body of the sphenoid bone is viewed from the internal base of the skull, there are 2 important structures in a region which is called the sella turcica, literally meaning the Turkish saddle, because it reminded early anatomists of the structure of a Turkish saddle. There is a depression, a hypophyseal fossa, where the pituitary gland rests, and over the pituitary gland is a region of the brain known as the hypothalamus. So these 2 are very important in the nervous and endocrine systems, and therefore this sella turcica region is an important landmark to identify the location of these softer tissues. Also, there are 2 openings, the optic foramina or optic canals, which allow the second cranial nerve, the optic nerve, to then extend from the brain to the retina in the orbit. The sphenoid bone is one of 4 bones of the skull and one of 3 bones of the cranium which possesses sinuses. These hollow spaces, which are lined by a mucous membrane. They serve to lighten skull bones, provide resonance chambers for speech, and the mucus provided drains into the nasal cavity where it helps moisten incoming air, and the mucus can bind foreign material and thus help protect the lungs. The sphenoid bone has a few additional foramina, such as the foramen rotundum, which is round, and the foramen ovale, which is oval, which serve for branches of the trigeminal nerve. One of the reasons for the great complexity of the sphenoid bone It is one of those composite bones which form from the fusion of a number of separate bony elements. So primitive vertebrates did not have a sphenoid bone. They had a number of smaller bones in the sphenoid area. And in the human fetus, these separate elements form, but then fuse to form the one solid sphenoid bone which we find in humans. One final note on the importance of the shape of the human sphenoid bone. Apes can't speak. They can perform sign language, but their vocal tract simply does not have the right shape to make the repertoire of sounds required for human speech. In hominid ancestors, the sphenoid region of the pharynx was shortened, and this was probably extremely significant in the evolution of speech. And so while the sphenoid bone is very often not appreciated for this, changes in it probably helped lead to human speech, which is one of the defining aspects of humanity.